Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I'm reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, the subject of one of my only mandatory read-alongs on this channel. I started this off in conjunction with Jane Austen July, which is a venerable old BookTube event that I love. And I'm just going to continue. We're reading every chapter. I am partaking here of what now is a long tradition on this channel of me reading you books and mentally vowing or even out loud vowing that I will keep the annotating to a minimum and then failing completely to do that. And apparently, from the emails that I've been getting, that's just fine with you. You actually want it that way. So we are up to chapter 13. Now, at the end of chapter 12, when Elizabeth and Jane have finally gone back to Longbourn, they've left Netherfield Hall. Jane is better. She is not sick anymore. I said at the end of chapter 12 that, okay, the Netherfield Hall little story blip is over for now. And there are two things hovering over the rest of the novel. Things hovering in the air that Jane Austen can pluck and concentrate on now that her this little problem is over. One of those things is the presence of the regiment. There is a regiment of redcoats in the neighborhood. So charismatic officers and also dashing young men in uniform. Which the two youngest Bennet daughters are enraptured by these uniformed men. And we might think that's trivial, but of course, if you've read the book, you know that's going to become very important. And thing number two is that Mr. Bingley at Netherfield Hall has promised a big ball. He's promised a dance at Netherfield. Get in a whole buffet, white soup, all sorts of invitations going out, and fill the place with the whole neighborhood, which is always a thing that people talk about in country towns. They talk about communal events. I said those two things were hovering over the book, and that's true. But that doesn't account for sudden plot twists. That's what we get in chapter 12. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party. What do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. Underscoring here, just briefly, that the Lucases come and go to Longbourn. They don't need to announce themselves. They're old friends of the family, which you saw already. You saw that in Elizabeth dealing with one of the daughters of the family. So, but I just to underscore. But anyway, let's move on. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Why, Jane, you never dropped a word of this, you sly thing. Well, I am sure I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley, but good Lord, how unlucky! There is not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hill this moment. Hill being the lady who runs the house, the lady who is in charge of the kitchen and making sure the laundry's done and everything, and who is a major character in Joe Baker's novel Longbourn. Here, just part of the furniture. Just amazing. I remember when I read Longbourn, I realized that the servants were so much a part of the furniture for Jane Austen that they were a part of the furniture for me too. In all the times I read all of her books, it never occurred to me to think about these servants. It never occurred to me to think, for instance, to pull a detail from Longbourn, that business that's so charming of Elizabeth tramping across country to make sure that Jane is okay, getting her dress all muddy and wet, that would have to be dealt with by the staff. She would just come back and dump that mess, that soiled garment, onto the staff. She wouldn't clean it herself. She wouldn't have the first idea how to do that. But anyway, I'm not doing well with the annotation parts. Anyway, let's go on. It is not Mr. Bingley, said her husband. It is a person whom I have never saw in the whole course of my life. Dun, dun, dun. This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters at once. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained. About a month ago, I received this letter. And about a fortnight ago, I answered it. He took 2 weeks to answer it. For I thought it a case of some delicacy, and requiring some early attention, because he's so dilatory that waiting 2 weeks on a letter is for him early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. This is a reference to something that's only been hinted at earlier, which is that Longbourn itself is entailed away from Mrs. Bennet and her daughters. It is Mr. Bennet's for his life. Then it goes in success, the property, everything, and it goes to somebody else. And since Mr. Bennet has no sons, it goes to a male cousin who can do anything he wants with it, and certainly is not going to want Mrs. Bennet and her daughters hanging around the place. "Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world when your estate should be entailed away from your own children. And I am sure if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it." Yes, yes. Well, she doesn't try to do anything about it, and Mr. Bennet doesn't either. You don't need to be an expert in Regency law to know how easy it would be to break this entail. Ridiculous that Mr. Bennet is so dilatory, so lackadaisical, so non-confrontational, loves to tease but doesn't like to confront, that he's not willing to take a chase into London and get this thing broken so that his own family isn't turned out on the road. But we'll get to whether or not Mr. Bennet is the bad Bennet parent. Don't you worry. You're not getting rid of me. Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain to her the nature of an entail. They wouldn't know. But still. They had often attempted it before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason. And she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters in favor of a man who nobody cared anything about. "It certainly is a most iniquitous affair," said Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." "No, that I am sure I shall not, and I think it was very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could not he keep on quarrelling with you, as his father did before? Why, indeed, he does seem to have some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear." And then Mr. Bennet has his way and reads the letter, and we get the letter. So this is the letter that Mr. Collins sent to the man who his father, Mr. Collins's father, argued and fought with forever. The father and Mr. Bennet were enemies. The father's now dead. "Dear sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honored father always gave me much uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach, but for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it seemed disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom it had always pleased him to be at variance." And here we get a little interjection as Mr. Bennet says, "There, Mrs. Bennet, see? That's exactly the note you were looking for." And then the letter goes on. "My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficences I have preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish, where it shall be my earliest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, to be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it is my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence. And on these grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends. But of this hereafter. If you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday sennight following, which I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to do the duty of the day. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and your daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. We know a few things from this letter. It is an olive branch. He's not lying. We know a few things from this letter, though. One is it's something that's going to be conveyed far, far more hilariously and more directly later on by Jane Austen, which is that Mr. Collins is an officious boob. It's pretty clear in this letter that he has an oily high opinion of himself. That's one thing that we gather from this. Another thing that might not be quite so obvious, a little more subtle in the letter, is that he definitely knows he has the whip hand here. He knows that it's in Mr. Collins' best interest to humor him in all things, since he gets Longbourn when Mr. Bennet dies. And the way you know that is that he proposes a visit, and then proposes the day, the time of day, and the extent of the visit. Without any asking. I am coming to your house, which, let's be honest, is really my house, on this date, and I'm staying for this long a time. Hope that won't be an inconvenience. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, as he folded up the letter, having given his wife and his household no more warning than that. He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he says about the girls, however, and if he is disposed to make them any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. That's Mrs. Bennet. She'd just been vilifying this guy. Somehow he hit the right note. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he can mean to make us an atonement he thinks is our due, the wish is certainly to his credit. Yeah, what does he mean by that? He's a curate. He's not wealthy enough to settle money on these girls. What can he mean? What does he have in mind? If you know the novel, you know what he has in mind, but still, it is a bit of a mystery. It is a bit of enigmatic. And this is the family. This is the whole family picking apart the letter, now that it's been read. Elizabeth was chiefly struck by his extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners whenever it were required. That is a very sarcastic Achilles heel in the letter, is that he is making a big deal out of the fact that since he's been ordained and established in a parish, he will do all the stuff that he has to do, instead of just delegating. He must be an oddity, I think, said she. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style. And what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the entail? We cannot suppose that he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him. This is Mr. Bennet smiling, his quiet, sardonic little smile, not because he's happy that an olive branch has been offered, but because it seems to him that he has met a new fool to mock, which is his favorite thing to do. Just like Elizabeth said at Netherfield, it's her favorite thing to do. It's his favorite thing to do, and that's why he thinks Mr. Collins has a lot of promise, because of his defects, because he seems like an officious booby. In point of composition, said Mary. Yay! Mary, of course, notices the rhetorical composition of the letter. His letter does not seem defective. The idea of the olive branch is perhaps not wholly new, yet I think it is well expressed. To Catherine and Lydia, so the narrative just moves right on. Mary speaks, but nobody cares about what she says. Nobody ever responds to it. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor the writer were in any degree interesting. It was next to impossible that their cousin should come in a scarlet coat, and it was now some weeks since that they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other color. Mr. Collins is a curate. He's not going to come in uniform. That's all the girls care about. As for their mother, Mr. Collins' letter had done away with much of her ill will, and she was preparing to see him with a degree of composure which astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins was punctual as to his time, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, said he had heard much of their beauty, but that, in this instance, fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them all in due time well disposed in marriage. This gallantry was not much to the taste of some of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet, who quarrelled with no compliments, answered most readily. Quarrelled with no compliments, what a wonderful phrase. You are very kind, sir, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly. You allude, perhaps, to the entail of the estate? Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for such things I know are all chance in the world. There is no knowing how estates will go once they come to be entailed. Listen to how nice she's being. Here's the very monster who has haunted her dreams. This horrible guy that she doesn't even want her husband to mention by name. Here he is in her house. She brings up the entail that he's going to benefit from at the expense of her daughters, and she's being nice. She's, I'm not faulting you. This is just the way of things. I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship of my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. But I can assure you, the young ladies, that I come prepared to admire them. And present I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted. Even if you haven't read this book, you could probably guess what he has in mind. He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins' admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its furniture were examined and praised, and his commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, was in turn highly admired, and he begged to know to which of his fair cousins the excellence of the cookery was owing. But here he was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with such asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Because keep in mind, in the Netherfield chapters, it is alluded that Charlotte Lucas does do the cooking at home, or at least helps with it. Here, the daughters don't. Hill oversees that. The kitchens are well seen to. That is the chapter. A bolt from the blue. our settled story. Who knew that we were going to hear from Mr. Collins, who will receive the entail? He will be the owner of Longbourn. Now he's in the picture, and he's going to be around for a while. he's an oily, pompous boob. So plenty of material to work with. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll resume next time. Thank you, BookTube.